This question from Donovan on Instagram to kick off with Nick Woltemade reportedly unhappy at Newcastle, where could we see the German striker end up in the summer? Andy?
I don't think this is an easy question to answer. And the main reason is because of the money, really. Because
they spent too much money on him.
I don't know if they spent too much money on him. I think they spent a realistic amount of money on him.
70 million?
Yeah, I think that is realistic in the modern context because, as we've said before, top price in the modern transfer market is not finished article player who's 27 years old. It's player who's somewhere between 19 and 24 with enormous upside. Woltemade arrives at 23, of course. In some ways, a bit of a late developer, but they've bought a player who is going in one direction and going in one direction very, very quickly. The speed with which he developed after signing from Werder Bremen to Stuttgart, especially in the back half of that season, was astonishing. So obviously people liked him for a long time for his raw materials, his height, his ability on the ball. The idea that with that ability on the ball that couldn't be taught, he could be taught the physical stuff, that he could grow into using his body better. And in a way, he started to do that at the beginning of the season at Newcastle when he was played as a number 9, even though, bear in mind that when Bayern Munich were looking to sign him, they were looking to play him off Harry Kane and sometimes instead of, to give him a rest, which would have been that side of his development. But I think when we're talking about the possible landing spots for Woltemade, and as you said, how much Newcastle have invested in him, if this was to go from being a difficult point in his Newcastle career, because remember, until he scored against Aston Villa at the weekend, he hadn't scored for 14 games. That's going to get in the head of any forward, let alone one that's been transferred to a Premier League club, a big Premier League club for a lot of money. And there is that pressure, even if he gives the impression of being quite a laid-back guy. The reason that Newcastle end up getting him, and the reason that this profoundly shocked German football, is because Newcastle's financial proposition, both to Stuttgart and to the player, absolutely blew Bayern out of the water. So look, when you look at Woltemade, if you look at it and forget about all the money bits, you think this is a guy who, when he's 26, is going to be playing for Bayern Munich and going to be great for them. How do they get to that point? Unless he plays really badly and plummets his value over the next season and a half, and, you know, there've been a little bit of teething problems, but we've seen more than enough from Woltemade in the Premier League to know that he's a very good player who looks to be heading towards that world-class plane, even if he has had a few difficulties, particularly in front of goal in the last little while, and they've had a difficulty working out tactically where and how they fit him. At the moment, I don't see how Bayern, for example, which would seem the most obvious place for him to go, are in a position to buy him. They can't. Newcastle will at least want their money back. You know, they've made an investment in Woltemade, not just for this season, but for the next 3, 4, 5, 6 seasons. That's what they've done. And so really, if they could get their money back, then maybe there would be a discussion. Then maybe there would be, if we're sticking with Eddie Howe in the medium to long term, there's a player that fits us better, rather than, in terms of strikers, us just getting, you know, like you have 2 types of drafts when you're drafting for the NBA. You get the player that fits you the best, or the best player that's still left on the board. I think if we're talking about Woltemade and where he would stand in that conversation, Newcastle have essentially gone and taken the best player on the board, rather than necessarily the one that fits. And we've seen some of that with, I think it's quite difficult to imagine them playing this quite rigid 4-3-3 with a super athletic midfield going forward if he's going to be the centre forward, and if he's not going to be the centre forward, where do you put him? But it's very, very hard to see how they could move him on if indeed they do decide, player and club do decide that's the best thing to do, without making a massive financial loss that's completely unpalatable.
And this is, it comes back to where you started that thought, Andy, on 70 million is the right price for him in this market. it's the right Premier League price for him in this market. There is not one simple European market anymore. There is a Premier League market, and then there is the rest of Europe market. And perhaps there are one or two clubs that could still shop in that Premier League price range. But even those ones generally will avoid it if they can. And I think that is the reality now. Every club that sells to the Premier League in a different European country looks at the fact they're getting a Premier League buyer and puts a different price tag on. That's just true. And I think that you could look at the negotiation for someone who I think is tremendously talented, but Lookman to Atletico, I think if he'd gone to a Premier League club, it's a different conversation in terms of what you expect you can get out of that deal. And I think that's just the reality of how things are now.
And the reason he hasn't gone to a Premier League club, it's not a knock on his ability or his achievements over recent. It's completely down to his age.
Yeah.
Like a Premier League club will not be buying a 28-year-old top of his game guy, will they?
Well,
they just won't.
Less likely. I don't think it's a never situation, but because I think there's
they're
always
more
clubs
likely
and
to buy
clubs.
like a John Duran.
Yeah.
Is not, John Duran is not a better player than Ademola Lookman, and for my money, he probably never will be. But is he a more valuable player in the market? Well, it's been proved time and time again over the last couple of years that he is.
Yeah, but then when it comes to the selling side of it as well, though, then you talk about someone like Daniel Marlin and what's he worth? I mean, he's immediately gone to Roma and started scoring, and frankly, I think everyone at Aston Villa's looked around and go, well, he was actually scoring pretty consistently for us when he was here, so he was useful. But the actual buy price at the end of this loan deal, I can't remember exactly now off the top of my head, but I think it's in the mid 20 millions. So the reality for Premier League clubs is if you're going to sell outside the Premier League, you're going to take a loss. The question is how and when are you likely to be willing to do that? And after 1 year is pretty painful, especially with a player who is still young and has all that value in theory tied up in them. I think you can look at plenty of examples of Premier League clubs who've got stuck with players and then have ended up just having to eat it. Romelu Lukaku is the most obvious one, goes back from Italy to Chelsea, pay way over the odds for him and end up basically having to not quite give him away for free, but effectively just let him be out on loan until his values, because of amortization, dropped enough that they can justify selling him.
I mean, you sell it to yourself by saying, we're not paying the wages anymore.
Yeah.
That's how you sell it to yourself, which is, I guess, if we're talking about the overall financial picture, is less a thing for a 22, 23-year-old player than it is for a 26, 27-year-old player. You know, you can afford to wait it out because the wages aren't quite as high. You know, he's not getting A++ level of wages. He's not say getting the same wages as Bruno Guimaraes, for example, if we want to put it in a Newcastle context, which is quite important to understand.
Yeah, although you've both talked about the finances, which is part of the question, where could we see the German striker end up in the summer? I wonder, though, if there isn't a question mark about which league could we see the German striker end up in the summer? Because although the reports are that he's got the hump with Newcastle, I wonder whether he hasn't got the hump with the Premier League, because he did find it a bit difficult when he started out. You know, he was getting bullied by defenders. He was getting bullied by defenders and complaining to the referees, and something wasn't right. And when you look at the number of goals he's scored in all competitions, this is, since that £70 million transfer, 10 goals, 7 million quid a goal. I wonder whether the problem is not so much the club, but the league, and which other leagues could he go to if they could afford him?
I think a lot of that to me is actually a little bit intangible, because I always think it's not just a league, it's a country and it's a culture and how you vibe with that environment that you find yourself in. And that's never like an absolute comment on, oh, Newcastle isn't as nice a place to live as somewhere else. It just might not be the place for Woltemade to want to live as much as somewhere else.
I have to say, looking at his Instagram, he's very much enjoying the bougie eateries of the Northeast.
So there you go. So perhaps I'm wrong on that one. But
Andy's our official Instagram watcher, so be careful. Be careful what you say.
But
be careful, or I'll unfollow you.
Be careful
big story.
Be careful what you post and all.
But I think it's fair to say, without having lived in either city, just to look at it from the point of view of what his options were this last summer, the two options are Munich and Newcastle. They're very different cities.
Yes.
They're very different energies. They're very different environments you're going to live in. And I do think things like that matter in ways that we don't always pick up on. I remember Dennis Bergkamp talking about how much different he felt in London compared to Milan, and how that reflected on his football. And that's just one example, but just the way you live does have a big impact. So that's hard to say. I mean, in terms of where he could end up, honestly, I'm with Andy in that I struggle to see where he can go that Newcastle are going to feel that they're going to get a deal they can accept, which is a real problem. In terms of clubs that want him, I mean, Bayern haven't stopped wanting him. I think it's the obvious places that he goes to Bayern instead. Whether that's realistic for all the financial reasons, I don't know.
Even if we take away the financial reasons, do you not think that's a potentially miserable experience while Harry Kane is still there?
Yeah.
I mean, because not only is like the fact that he won't play instead of Harry Kane, he will play with Harry Kane, potentially in that number 10 role, which we've seen him tried more recently with Newcastle, which I think he really suits. But Kane isn't a number 9 who just stays there, is he? He's a number 9 who drops to the halfway line. Everything that Bayern are is built around Harry Kane. Now, of course, there's this possibility of him leaving this summer, be for Barcelona or the Saudi Pro League, for example. Maybe that changes the game, and maybe there's a discussion on Woltemade to be had when it comes to the summer. We'll wait and see. And maybe Newcastle can get a little bit closer to their valuation if Woltemade has a good World Cup. That's another thing we have to add to that. But while Kane is at Bayern, despite the fact that Bayern had this vision that in the short term, Kane and Woltemade could play together, I just don't see it.
Yeah, and Donovan on Instagram, I think you will agree. That was a really well answered question. So thank you. This from Xavier on X. Is the Serie A title race over after AC Milan's draw against Como, Nicky?
I don't think it's over. It's definitely on life support. But I think it was maybe already was before this result. And the reason for that is just because I think the gulf between Inter and everyone else is so significant. And even though they did lose to Bode in this week, and we talked about that on the main show, the reality is I think it's now the last 14 Serie A games, Inter have dropped 2 points, and until they drop some points, I mean, with this draw they're now I think it's 7 points ahead of Milan, so until Inter drop some points it's going to be hard for anyone to catch them, and there is still a Milan derby to come, so that's the big opportunity for Milan to create a wobble. And up until the Derby d'Italia, where they got a massive helping hand from officiating, Inter have really just struggled in the big head-to-heads against their direct rivals. So before that Derby d'Italia, they hadn't beaten any of Milan, Juventus and Napoli for a combined 14 games. So there's a chance that Milan beat them and reopen things, and I think they do need to beat them now. And it's worth saying that Milan have not lost since the very start of the season. They're more than 20 games unbeaten as well. So they are very consistent under Max Allegri. But I think the issue is just Inter are going to be hard to pull in unless this Bode result sparks a wobble, unless the things we talked about with their defending suddenly start to become more exposed, their tiredness starts to tell, and they start to fall apart. That's the big issue. Milan have been great, and actually me and Andy talked about it, the teams we saw finishing in the top 4, and we actually both agreed, I think, on our top 4s.
Yeah.
But I think Milan after Inter are by far the safest one. But they have got a big gap to make up.
But I guess this game really underlined the context of where Milan are. That really, the realistic aim at the start of the season is make sure you get in the Champions League. You know, if you're a title contender, that feels like playing with house money, doesn't it? Really, it doesn't feel realistic when you feel like what a mess last season was with two very different coaches in Fonseca and Conceição, and that seems like a million years ago now. I think that really underlines what a good job Max Allegri has done. But the fact that they were pushed like this by Como underlines where they really are. That really they're fighting for a Champions League place, just as Como are from a lower position. But I think that tells you what their real fight is this season.
I think the talent level in that team, when you go through it, there's some standout pieces, obviously, when you see Luka Modric and you get excited about Luka Modric. And obviously, we've talked for years about Rafael Leao and what he is or he isn't when he's good. And he did score that goal in this game. He's pretty great. But I think, for instance, to me, the sense that Milan had a real title challenge in them has really slipped a lot since Christian Pulisic has been dealing with this ongoing hip issue, this bursitis, which he did play in this game, but it was only off the bench. He hasn't been able to start recently. His scoring record is, when he has been available, is nowhere near where it was at the start of the season. It's very obvious that this is a thing that's undermining him at the moment, and perhaps with the World Cup in mind, I dare say there's a few US fans who'd rather he was just given a nice long rest at the moment, which he probably can't get. But I do think that Milan, they just don't have the depth of quality that Inter do. And Inter have their problems too. We talked about it again with their defence and the things they're lacking. But Inter, squad depth-wise, are just in a different category, I think, to teams like Milan. And look, Como are a good team. Drawing with Como, not a terrible result. Como have got themselves in this Champions League fight as well. And Cesc Fabregas is doing a lot right there. But I agree with Andy that it feels like... the goal was the Champions League. They're very, very safely on track for that. I just don't quite think they've got enough in them to hold down this Inter team that don't slip up except in the big games.
Got a question here from Dermot on email, and Dermot is clearly over 18. How do I know? Well, he asks about the European Super League. What's that? He says, with the European Super League dying out after Real Madrid's dispute with UEFA, is there a chance that we could see something similar come back in the near future?
I take the word near out. I think future, definitely. Now, I think Barcelona pulling out of the ESL project is one thing. Real Madrid pulling out of it is another thing, because they were the main driver behind it. And, we were left with the three amici of Real Madrid, Juventus and Barcelona. And they've gradually left Real Madrid in a position where they have to make nice with UEFA for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because no one else is in it. You can't have a league if no one else is in it. But I think we can't lose sight of what this was about, really. And what this was about is not about making a better competition. It was about earning the right to organise your own competitions and cut UEFA out of the picture and make more money for yourselves. Now, obviously, publicly, the excuse that Real Madrid always used for this, and Barcelona, was we've got to make up the gap with the Premier League. But that was always a bit of a straw man argument, really, because if you're making the extra money, the Premier League clubs will be making that extra money as well, because you can't really have a Super League without them being involved. Now, both iterations of the Super League over the last couple of years have been poorly planned and been poorly presented, I think it's fair to say. Two of the major blocks to it, of course, is the fact that in the aftermath of the original Super League rollout, going back a few years now, Paris Saint-Germain and Nasser Al-Khelaifi used that as an opportunity to get in and solidify their power and influence within UEFA and the ECA. So that has changed the balance of how things are. But I think as well, you have to look at the fact that you can't get the German clubs involved at all. There's so much cultural resistance that you can't have Bayern and Dortmund. They just can't be part of it. So there are so many holes in what this original idea was. And of course, the biggest thing over the last year or two has been the fact that there's been this court case that really sort of backed Real Madrid as they see it. Of course, both sides claimed a term of victory. But this court case that gave Real Madrid reason to say that UEFA were running an unfair monopoly on the game. So that is something that they won't have lost sight of. But where they are at the moment is they've got no other teams to be in. They've got no other clubs to be in it. They've got increased money, which they already wanted from the reformatting of the Champions League with extra games. And they know that Alexander Ceferin is likely to be given an unprecedented extra term as UEFA president, so they've got to continue a relationship with him. But the result of that court case won't be something they've forgotten. And if we're talking about them coming back to this to get a bigger slice of the pie later on, of course they still have that in mind.
Any thoughts on this?
Well, I was just thinking to an extent, the project already succeeded. I think to an extent is key here. But what were the goals of the original project? And some of them they certainly haven't succeeded in, because I think the biggest one is creating a competition that they can't fall out of, right? I think part of the impetus for, at least for some clubs, probably less for Real Madrid, who are always in the Champions League anyway, but for some of the clubs who are signing up to this, certainly the Italian ones, it was, some years we don't qualify for the Champions League. Some years we don't get in, and that's really important.
And Barcelona were in a wholly different position at the beginning of this, weren't they?
Yeah, but I mean, Juventus, so again, a core member of this group for such a long time, they might not be in the Champions League next season, so that they certainly haven't achieved, although they have increased their odds slightly by making it so that you get, some leagues now have 5 teams rather than 4, so a slight increase on that. They have made it so that there is what is effectively a year-by-year Super League with this giant league table, which means you get more games. And also, I think the thinking behind this current format is it should, over time, favour the bigger clubs, because it's harder for them to not make it through to the knockout rounds, which means you get more games. I mean, some of the Italian clubs are doing their best to go out as quick as they can this year, it seems like. But the theory behind it, and I think the reality behind it, is still that it's going to generate more money for some of these teams. So at least in some of their goals, they've succeeded. But I do think it's always an ongoing battle. The richest clubs will always be looking for ways to make more money, and that's why, as Andy says, near term, I think we're set for a little bit. But I don't think the impetus behind that original Super League ever goes away. And so if an opportunity arises where they think they can do it again, or something similar to it, I don't think the desire for it has suddenly disappeared. The rich always want to get richer.
Here's a question from Charles_F5 on YouTube. With Marseille's season in tatters after the exit of De Zerbi, is there a chance they could be leapfrogged by Lille and Rennes in Ligue?
Rennes, yes, I think. Lille are in a quite bad place for different reasons at the moment. But Rennes, who are just about to, with their coach that they've got rid of, Habib Bey, the next man at Marseille, interestingly, that means that they've got Francaise, who really wasn't given the conditions to do a great job, but has been a terrific coach in Ligue 1 in recent years, coming in to boost them. And they do have good players, Rennes. So I think in terms of, if one of those teams was going to catch up Marseille, then I think it would be Rennes. Having said that, knowing what's going to happen next for Marseille, I think is an interesting question. Now, Charles talks about their season being in tatters. It looked like that last weekend, certainly, because they lose a 2-0 lead at home to Strasbourg with a 96-minute equaliser by Joaquin Paniquet. They have all sorts of displeasure shown to them by the fans. To Frank McCourt, to Pablo Longoria, the president, protests against them. Fans not turning up and coordinating a late arrival so the stands are emptied. The stick that some of the biggest players are getting, so Benjamin Pavard and Pierre-Emile Højbjerg were targets as well. And because Lyon won on the Sunday, that means that Marseille are 5 points off third place. Now that matters because we talk about the top 4 in different countries. It's top 3 that automatically qualify for the Champions League in France. 4th place could be a Champions League place, but puts you in the 3rd qualifying round. So you'd have to do 3rd qualifying round and then playoffs. And that is always very difficult to plan around because you're looking to do your transfer window. You don't really know whether you can do your big boy transfer window until you get to like 5-6 days before the deadline. So that is tough. But things have changed a little bit in Marseille since then. So Mehdi Bonatti had resigned as sporting director, but he has been persuaded to stay on. given more power and responsibility, including the power and responsibility to appoint the next coach, which will be Habib Bey. He was Benatia's pick. And some of those responsibilities have been taken away from Longoria, who will be doing mainly administrative and strategic roles, in inverted commas, from now on. So, with Bey in charge, and Bey is someone who didn't do a terrible job at Rennes, who is someone who's a former captain of Marseille, so he understands the very particular pressure. It's not off the table that they could do something in the rest of this season. This season isn't finished by any stretch of the imagination. The big bit for them is at the start of March, they play Lyon at the Velodrome in the Ligue, and then they've got a home game, a Coupe de France quarter-final against Toulouse. Those two home games are everything. They need to win both of those, and then they can start getting their season back on the rails. But for whatever issues you might have with Frank McCourt, believe me, the Marseille fans have got a lot of issues with him, I think giving Benatia the power to just deal with it all on his own, he's convincing, he's largely respected by the squad, even though he does have quite a poor relationship with Mason Greenwood, reportedly. And I think from now till the end of the season, that makes perfect sense, because with the money they've been spending over the last couple of years and with the magnitude of the club, they just have to get back into the Champions League.
I feel like maybe the view on teams that are capable of being in this conversation was, it feels like those two are picked out because they're next to down the league table, but actually both of them not in just great form. 2 wins in the last 12 between them, so I don't think they're necessarily the only ones to look at. I feel like Monaco, who obviously gave PSG a run for their money in the cup, and also have had, I mean, they smashed Rennes 4-0 not that long ago, and have had an interesting January with Adingra coming in and making an immediate impact. I think if someone's going to run up on you, it might just be Monaco at the moment.
It feels like they're a long way off. It feels like they're a long way off, both in terms of what they can do and points-wise, I think. But you're right, at least they won't have Champions League after next week, will they? So bit more time and space, just like Marseille.
Yeah, all of these questions are interesting, but this one's a fascinating one. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on this. Fred500 on Instagram says there were 50,000 fans in attendance to watch Köln's under-19 team take on Inter Milan. Is there any reason for the appetite for youth games?
Yeah, there's a couple of strands to this. Firstly, Cologne is an incredibly passionate football city. We have to bear that in mind. And it's really hard to get a ticket to see FC Köln play at home at the Rhein-Energie Stadion. So I think a lot of people leapt at the chance to get into the Rhein-Energie Stadion. And, you know, I remember like going there with my younger son the season before last, when Köln were heading towards relegation. They had a really quite terrible team. And like, you couldn't get a ticket for love nor money. It was really, we were lucky to get in. It was very, very difficult. And that's how much of a football city and how much of a passionately followed club this is. So I think the opportunity for fans to actually get in there who couldn't normally for a relatively low price was a big deal. Of course, there's the fact that Köln's team being in the youth league, especially when Köln aren't regularly in Europe themselves, the senior team is a big deal as well. Playing Inter is a big deal. And Köln's under-19 team have done really well over the last couple of years. You know, they're heading towards winning a title for a third successive time. But I think if we're looking for something else as well, you're looking at the fact that for the first time in a while, you've got like a standard bearer for the youth team in the first team at Köln. You've got Said Al-Mala, the 19-year-old who's come through this season, winger, played brilliantly. I think the fact that he's not getting picked for the 11 all the time might eventually see the end of Lukas Krasniok, the coach, because the fans are really not happy that Al-Mala's not in the team all the time. They know that they won't have Al-Mala forever, so they just want to see him every week at the moment. And he's really the first one of that sort of elite level that they've had since Florian Wirtz, and of course he did a midnight flip for Leverkusen when he was still 16. So they never got to see him in the first team, Florian Wirtz. So Elmala is a precious player to those FC Köln supporters, and I think it does make explicit that, you know, this is maybe where our next good team is coming from. You know, Köln aren't a team or aren't a club who can go out and spend a fortune in the market. So if they can bring up more players of this sort, that could be their future in the Bundesliga, which are fighting very, very hard to stay in this season. And the idea that you can see the next Elmala is an exciting one.
I don't know. I think sometimes at the moment as well, there's just an element for lots of people that we've talked so much in this last 2 shows we've been recording about money and the impact that has on football. I think there's something appealing to lots of football fans about getting to watch I mean, not that there isn't a huge influence of money on what people's youth teams look like, but it just feels a little step removed from the most cynical, most purely financially driven version of football, and you get to watch a certain different energy to the game. I think there's people are looking for that more than they used to, I think. And there's also something about just hype builds hype, isn't there? When you get an event like this, when people start buying tickets and suddenly it's looking like being a sellout, then suddenly everyone wants in on it, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, on that note, you'd think we were going to ask you to recommend a game of the week in the North London derby, wouldn't you? However, I said I wouldn't mention it. I haven't said a word. I just thought... However, it's now time for our game of the week. Each week we recommend a game for you to watch at the weekend, and just as importantly, we also suggest what you should eat with it. Andy, what are you going for this week?
Well, I've had a bit of a think about this, and in the end, it had to be one. It had to be RB Leipzig against Borussia Dortmund. Now, Dortmund are on a really good run at the moment. They are not quite keeping a title race going, but they are keeping the prospect of a title race going, I suppose you could say. So they're 6 points behind Bayern at the moment, which is a far narrower gap than it was at the start of the year. They, for the last 2 weekends, because they've played before Bayern, they've closed it to 3 points before Bayern have then gone on and won their games following that against Hoffenheim against Hoffenheim and then at Werder Bremen. And this is a game that Dortmund really have to win, I think. Now, Leipzig need a win to get themselves back in the top 4. Stuttgart overtook them last week because Leipzig dropped a couple of points at home to Wolfsburg, which no one was really expecting. But to really keep this title race going, what we need is Dortmund to keep it at 6 points for when they play the Klassiker at the end of the month. That's the most important thing. So if they can win and get through to this close to 6 points with Bayern, that will have a massive effect on the Klassiker. Is that to say that Dortmund are genuine title contenders and they can win the Bundesliga? I don't think it does say any of those things. But it says we can keep the suspense going a little bit, which is the most important thing. And obviously, ever since Leipzig have come up, going back, 8-9 years now, there's been an enormous amount of needle because they're coming from 2 very different ideological places, the supporters, between Leipzig and Dortmund, that has sometimes edged over into the quite unpleasant. But I think it'll be a great game. For food, I'm going to have to go very rudimentary here because, of course, this is a 5:30 p.m. kickoff.
It's pork knuckle, isn't it? You're going pork knuckle again.
I'm not going pork
knuckle. I can see it in your eyes.
You haven't got time to sit down and eat for this one. It's not possible. Now, Leipzig might not be Köln in more ways than one, but at the end of the road where the Red Bull Arena is, there is an excellent kebab shop. And Germany, as we know, does kebabs like few other places.
It's the home of the doner
in Northern
kebab.
Europe. It certainly is. Yeah. So we're going straight for the chicken doner here.
So that was Leipzig versus Borussia Dortmund, Saturday 5:30 p.m. Nicky? And by the way, may I say, you look elegant, very elegant. So we've got to eat something nice with that dress.
I was wondering where that was going. Okay, right.
Yeah, just letting you know.
Well, you certainly need to look the part to support Como, don't you? Although they're away from home this week against Juventus. I'm sorry for on the continent listeners who are thinking, oh, we had a Juventus game last week. But do you know what? They are really enjoyable to watch at the moment. Not necessarily, probably less, maybe if you're a Juventus fan, more enjoyable, I think, for the many Italian fans who feel a certain amount of schadenfreude about watching Juventus lose at the moment. But listen, that they're really fun to watch. They concede lots of goals. They also score lots of goals. They desperately need a result here, having lost to Inter and then having lost in the Champions League with the second leg of that Galatasaray game looming. They've now got 5th versus 6th in Serie A. They need to finish in the top 4, get back into the Champions League. They're currently 1 point behind Roma, but Como are only 4 points behind them. And this could very much be a chance for Como to pull themselves into that Champions League conversation, having nearly managed it against Milan, who they were ahead against. So watch it, because Juventus are one of those fascinating sideshows at the moment where you don't quite know what you're going to get, but it's probably going to be fun. Watch it because Como and Cesc Fabregas, despite being called a little boy by Max Allegri after the Milan game, which is a line we didn't manage to get in there, but yes, Allegri taking umbrage at Fabregas, complaining, calling him a bambino, little boy, still learning what he's doing. But despite still being a young thing, learning what he's doing, has got that Como team playing some really fun football. So I think that'll be a fun game to watch. And since Dotun is just clearly itching for a sit-down meal, Turin is good for old, adapted aristocratic food. And if you are so inclined, the classic in Piedmont is vitello tonato. It's not for me. It's veal with like a creamy tuna sauce. So for me, I'll pass on that. But it's very classic Turin, and if that's what you want, a bit more of an old aristocratic dish, have at it. I'll stick with agnolotti del Plin, which is like another, because there's 100 of them in Italy, many more with different names. Another stuffed pasta with, usually it's beef, but sometimes there's rabbit in there as well, and a nice buttery sauce.
You can keep the rabbit to yourself. I'll stick to the beef one if you don't mind. Little Bugs Bunny, no. Juventus versus Como, that's Saturday at 2 p.m.